The emergence of Kurdish nationalism. The Hamidiye. The creation of the Hamidiye light cavalry regiments delineates the second stage of Kurdish nationalism. Bayram Kodaman suggests that Abdülhamid II's creation of the Hamidiye reflected the four major objectives of his regime: centralization, Islamic unity, the politics of balance, and the politics of reform. Stephen Duguid sees the post-1878 period as representing a fundamental shift in the Ottoman self-view. Abdülhamid's creation of the Kurdish light cavalry was an effort to help realize his four major political objectives. It would tie the empire more firmly to its Muslim roots and provide a defense against Russia and the Armenians, both increasingly aggressive after 1878, and the Kurds could be used as a balance against the urban notables and the provincial governments. The successful implementation of these policies would allow the government further to centralize its authority. The creation of the Hamidiye was also a result of the relations between Abdülhamid II and the tribes of eastern Anatolia. After the failure of Ubeydullah's movement, Abdülhamid attempted to draw the Kurdish tribes closer and to organize them against the Armenians and their backers, the British. The Russians became amenable to this policy after 1883. They were also opposed to the creation of an independent Armenia. By 1884, Valis, governors of provinces, personally appointed by Abdülhamid and responsible to him, were soliciting the support of the tribal leaders and supplying them with arms. Kodaman argues that during the period 1885 to 1890 the Porte was able to get some control over the tribes through this solicitous policy, and that the Ottomans also took pains to pay attention to the demands of the Armenians. Most historians of this period see little Ottoman concern with the demands and concerns of the Armenians. Whatever the intentions of the Ottoman government toward the Armenians from 1885 to 1890, increased Armenian independence activities after 1890 threatened, in the view of Abdülhamid, not only the state, but also his tribal policy and hence all of his desired reforms. The creation of the Hamidiye was not solely for the purposes of using the Kurdish cavalry against the Armenians. Kodaman and Duguid suggest that creation of the Hamidiye has to be placed in the context of the larger objectives of Abdülhamid's policies: to establish central authority, to create a new social-political balance, to make the government more effective in eastern Anatolia, to take advantage of tribal forces for military purposes, to use the cavalry against the Armenians and to equalize the balance of power, at least military power, to protect against Russian invasion and impede or stop Great Britain's policies of penetration in eastern Anatolia, and to implement the policy of pan-Islam. All of these objectives were compatible with the fundamental shift in Ottoman politics to try to establish greater Muslim unity. The Hamidiye and the Kurds were to be part of this policy. In spite of the several objectives that the Ottomans hoped to achieve by the establishment of the Hamidiye, it was established in direct response to increased Armenian activities in 1891. Also, Abdülhamid had been in power for 13 years by 1891. If the Hamidiye was such an important catalyst to his reform, why had it not been implemented before? The regiments were to be under the command of Musha Zeki Pasha, who was married to a sister of Abdülhamid, and were to consist of not less than 4 companies and not more than 6. Each regiment was to have at least 512 men and not more than 1,152. Large tribes were able to commit enough men to make an entire regiment. Smaller tribes were given the right to commit enough men for 1 company. The regiments were forbidden to unify except in times of war and only at the order of the commanding general. The tribes were to submit population figures to the Interior Ministry on all men between the ages of 17 and 40. The officers of the regiments were sent to a special school in Istanbul. While a Kurd could rise to the rank of colonel, his assistant had to be a regular Ottoman soldier. The tribes that were granted the right to create a regiment or a company of men gained many advantages. In the competition, the larger tribes, especially those that had some record of loyalty to the state, were favored by the Porte. The tribes had to be Sunni to fit into Abdülhamid's pan-Islamic policy. Once a tribe reached Hamidiye status and received weapons, in addition to increased prestige, its ability to dominate and at times to intimidate and terrorize smaller tribes increased markedly. Also, a large and strong tribe out of favor with the government could be brought to heel by being excluded from participating in the Hamidiye. Alternatively, a Hamidiye tribe could be sent against a recalcitrant tribe. To be excluded from the Hamidiye meant those tribes were available for conscription into the regular army. This is the first time that Kurdish tribesmen were required to serve in Ottoman forces, not necessarily in Kurdistan. This conscription, which paralleled the creation of the Hamidiye, spurred interest and a desire to serve in the Hamidiye. After the creation of the Hamidiye, it was deployed on two fronts. The first was between Erzurum and Van, and the second in the Mardin-Urfa region, one against the Russians and the other against the British. Both regiments were attached to the 4th Army under the command of Musha Zeki Pasha, who acted as protector of the Kurds against their main enemies, the local governments. Zeki Pasha's protection of the Kurds against the Valis, themselves appointed by Abdülhamid, indicates how frustrating and difficult it must have been for the Valis to implement reforms in eastern Anatolia. The Sultan's close ties with Zeki Pasha also suggest that his main goal may have been to use the Kurds against the Armenians. The employment of the Hamidiye in the Erzurum Van and Mardin-Urfa regions would have enabled it not only to be used against Russia, with whom relations were not threatening at the time, or Great Britain, but also to be employed both north and south of the Armenians. For example, in spite of Hamidiye atrocities against the Armenians in Sasan on the 22nd of September 1893, recruitment continued unabated. By 1895, the Hamidiye consisted of 57 regiments. If we calculate 512 as the least number of men in a regiment and 1,152 as the most, that would mean that between 29,184 to 65,664 Kurds were serving in the Hamidiye. At an average of 832 men in each regiment, the total figure would be some 47,000 men, all well armed. In 1896, in the wake of increased Armenian revolutionary activity, the Hamidiye was sent against the Armenians, which resulted in much bloodshed for both parties. Some Armenians were massacred. These events in many ways marked the culmination of the tension and suspicions between Armenians and Kurds since 1878. Their struggle had assumed the characteristics of a civil war, with the Ottomans supporting the Kurds and the Russians and the British the Armenians. More bloodshed was to follow. The Hamidiye continued after the deposition of its founder and benefactor, Abdülhamid II. Between 1908 and 1910, the regiments were reorganized and the name was changed to tribal regiments by Mahmud Shevket Pasha, the commander of the Third Army, who had led the attack against the counter-revolution of the 13th of April 1909. For a while, it was contemplated to change the name of the regiments to Uz al-Ilaru, but Mahmud Shevket Pasha was of the opinion that Uz would be construed as Uyuz, mangy or weak, a play on words the detractors of the regiments would obviously relish. The word Uz referred to an early Turkic tribal confederation and conveyed a sense of strength. The fact that the early Uz confederation contained no Kurds did not seem to bother Mahmud Shevket Pasha. It is interesting that the word Uz was considered. It had much more of a nationalist, Turkish, than tribal meaning. It does indicate, however, that the Young Turks were to follow essentially the politics of Abdülhamid II in terms of harnessing the Kurdish tribal regiments to the cause of the Young Turks and increasingly to Turkish nationalism. Perhaps, assigning the name of the earliest Turkish tribal confederation to Kurdish tribal regiments could also have been more than the budding Turkish nationalists thought desirable. The Young Turks also considered using the Kurdish cavalry regiments in guerrilla warfare. The regiments continued to grow under the Young Turks, expanding to 64 in August 1910. Calculating each regiment at 832 men, this would mean that over 53,000 men were enlisted. 3 tribal regiments from the Urfa and Viranshahir regions alone were sent to fight in the Balkan Wars. With the outbreak of World War I, the regiments were sufficiently armed and organized to play a major role, especially on the Eastern Front, where they were attached to the Third Army and fought loyally in the Ottoman forces. The creation of the Hamidiye had both negative and positive consequences for the evolution of Kurdish nationalism. Among the most negative consequences were the intertribal Sunni-Shiite rivalries that were created. The regiments were enrolled from only Sunni tribes in accordance with Abdulhamid's pan-Islamic policy. This greatly weakened the position of the Shi'is and or Alevi tribes and increased the hostility between the Sunnis and Shi'is generally. Sheriff Firat, who chronicled some of these conflicts, indicates how this situation led to unremitting hostility between his own Alevi tribe, the Hormek, and the Sunni Gibran tribe, which formed 4 Hamidiye regiments. This hostility continued until the Sheikh Said rebellion in 1925. Firat characterizes the Gibran tribe as one of the most powerful in Kurdistan and one of the most loyal to Abdulhamid II. The Hormek, on the other hand, were property owners, peasants who considered themselves non-tribal and non-Kurdish, belonging to a subdivision of Turkmen. Even given the fact that Firat was writing in 1948, and taking into consideration his desire and eagerness to portray the Hormek as non-Kurdish, in fact, throughout his book Firat makes the case that the Kurds are of Turkic origin and that it was Abdulhamid's policies and the Hamidiye that forced many of the people of eastern Anatolia to consider themselves Kurds. He indicates graphically the enmity created by the Hamidiye. The Gibrans were the leaders and administrators of Mush and Varto. They were commanders of Hamidiye regiments, gendarmes, and police. Hormek requests to government offices were usually rejected. Their possessions, land, and lives were in constant jeopardy. They were the hated Alavis or Kazelbash. The Hamidiye commanders confiscated the land of the Alavis and the non-Hamidiye tribes. Every Hamidiye commander became a derabey, large landowner, similar to the emirates that had existed until 1847. Every grievance and feud was settled in favor of the Hamidiye tribes. After clashes with the Gibrans and rejection of all their complaints to the government authorities, most of whom seemed to be Gibrans, the Hormek and other Alavis and non-Hamidiye tribes began to oppose the government. This opposition continued until the Sheikh Said rebellion. The Gibrans were responsible for killing Ibrahim Talu, the venerated leader of the Hormek, in October 1894, a grisly murder the Hormek and Talu's family were never to forget. Ibrahim Talu's son Zainal became a relentless foe of the Gibrans for the next 12 years. He was killed in 1906. The commander of the 2nd Gibran Hamidiye Regiment, responsible for tracking down and killing Zainal, was Khalid Beg Gibran, who was to become one of the principal leaders of the Sheikh Said rebellion. The Alevi tribes of the Dersim Tunceli region were not to forget Khalid Beg's actions. They did not join him in his fight against the Kemalists in 1925. The Alevi tribes, even those that spoke the Zaza dialect like the Gibrans, did not join the Sheikh Said rebellion. Indeed, some Alevi tribes even fought against Sheikh Said in defense of the new Turkish Republic. The Alavis saw no reason to support a rebellion led by a Sunni Naqshbandi sheikh who was the commander of many tribes that had participated in the Hamidiye, at whose hands they had suffered so much. When a consciousness of Kurdish nationalism began to be felt in the community, it was largely a Sunni affair. The Alavis felt little loss with the abolition of the caliphate. After all, it was the Caliph, Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had created the Hamidiye, the source of so many of their grievances, hardships, and woes. The Hamidiye regiments were an important stage in the emergence of Kurdish nationalism from 1891 to 1914. Serving as a fulcrum of Kurdish power for over 2 decades. There had not been such a concentration of Kurdish power and authority since 1847. From 1895 to 1914, the Kurds had 50,000 men, perhaps considerably more, under arms, most of whom were located in eastern Anatolia. 5 regiments were stationed in Syria. Some of the regiments fought in the Balkan Wars, where they experienced contemporary warfare before the outbreak of World War I. The Kurds and their officers were exposed not only to Turkish nationalism, but to Balkan nationalism. While the research on this topic is scarce, the Kurds, especially the officers who had been trained in the schools established by Abdülhamid, became aware of the international politics that had contributed to the Balkan Wars. The nationalism of the Balkan people must have seemed familiar to them as it had to Turkish officers before them. They also must have come to understand the thinking of their fellow Turkish officers as well as Arab officers. It certainly would not be incongruous for an educated Kurdish officer to identify with Turkish nationalism, and find it similar to his own nationalistic thoughts and feelings. The Hamidiye gave an opportunity for the Kurds to experience and attempt to fathom the wider world. The provision of the decrees creating the Hamidiye provided for schools for the officers of the regiments. Children of the tribal leaders would be allowed to attend military school, a development that was to have far-reaching effects. For the first time, there was a cadre of Kurds educated in the contemporary curriculum obtaining in Istanbul. The Kurds were exposed to the same education as their fellow Turkish and Arab officers at a time when many innovations were being made in the curriculum. Many of the educational reforms were secular in nature. Abdülhamid's policies, implemented via the Hamidiye, also allowed the Kurds to oppose the bureaucracy of the Porte and their counterparts in the provinces more forcefully. Kurds looked upon the bureaucrats as implementing reforms that favored the creation of an Armenian state. Those Ottoman bureaucrats, willing or not, seemed to be the instruments of the European and Christian powers who advocated the reforms. Such a situation must have contributed to the Kurdish sense that they had to take matters into their own hands. The Hamidiye gave them this opportunity, with an Islamic touch. It is not just that Abdülhamid II was such a staunch Muslim or the Kurds so enamored of the caliphate. After all, they had not proven particularly beholden to it at times in the past. Abdülhamid's policies of Islamic unity allowed for some concession to Kurdish power and authority. It is difficult to speculate what his policy would have been if he had ruled for another 20 years. It is unlikely he would have supported the creation of an independent Kurdish state, especially with the absence of the Armenians. Given the evolution of Turkish nationalism, he probably would not even have supported autonomy for the Kurds. In fact, the Sultan himself began to change his policies in the late 1890s. Part of this shift may have been that the Hamidiye could consolidate many of the Kurdish tribes that had been fragmented since 1847. The critics, even the Kurdish ones, are quick to point out that this meant a resurrection of the derebays of the first part of the century. But these observations seem to be a bit wide of the mark. The derebays had existed in a non-nationalist polity, but this was decidedly not the case in 1900, let alone by 1914. While it is true that most of the Hamidiye leaders did not have the vision of Sheikh Ubaydallah, neither were their circumstances as propitious. The Hamidiye leaders did not have the political power of the emirs, they were not Badir Khans or Muhammad Pashas. But this is not paradoxical. Nationalist ideas are more parochial and narrow than the more universal ideas of sultan, caliph, shah, or hereditary prince. They are also more antagonistic and fractious. If the ideas that emerged along with the development of the Hamidiye had been allowed to continue, it is unlikely that they would have evolved along nationalist lines. It is no irony that the pan-Islamic policies of Abdülhamid II contributed to a stronger sense of Kurdish nationalism. Such ideas are usually ubiquitous when polities are in decline or having difficulty. In these circumstances, minority groups can develop their own polities without denying their allegiance to the symbol or symbols of their shared polity, whether caliph, sultan, king, or emperor. It was the policies of Abdülhamid II and the symbols of the caliphate that the Turkish nationalists opposed. The creation of the Hamidiye also meant an internal shift of power in Kurdistan that led to a reduction of the power of the sheikhs. Sheikh Ubaydallah's movement had indicated the strength of the combined power of a religious political leader. No one would be more aware of this than Sultan Abdulhamid II. Among the several reasons for creating the Hamidiye was the desire to reduce the power of the sheikhs. Tribal leaders would be more easily controlled, their jurisdiction would be in much smaller areas. They also would be less tempted to make cross-border appeals or invasions into other countries. A movement such as Ubaydallah's into Iran might have resulted in the introduction of European or Russian forces, the last thing Abdulhamid wanted at this juncture. It is true that the rebellion of 1925 was led by a sheikh, but it was much more permeated and supported by nationalist ideas and by the nationalists themselves than Sheikh Ubaydallah ever hoped or, indeed, probably would have wanted. The interval between Sheikh Ubaydallah and Sheikh Zayed was led by secular leaders, a necessary intermezzo in the evolution of Kurdish nationalism. It was also recognition by the organizers of Sheikh Said's rebellion of the strengths of tribal societies, and the weakness of the emerging nationalist slogans and appeals unless expressed in religious symbols, and language by a man of religion with an impeccable and popular reputation. Many scholars of late 19th century and early 20th century Ottoman history are of the opinion that Abdulhamid's policies were a failure. The proof is that his regime was toppled by the Young Turks. Scholars of Kurdish history and nationalism usually consider this period a backward step in the evolution of a state structure, because it is marked by tribal rule and the ruthless plunder and oppression by the Hamidiye against non-Hamidiye, especially the Alevi tribes. In addition, the Hamidiye suppressed and curtailed the emergence of the artisan and merchant class, a potential middle class, the usual bearer of nationalism. But it must be remembered that a substantial number of these classes in eastern Anatolia were Turkish. An increase in their power would hardly have benefited the development of Kurdish nationalism. The tragedy from the Kurdish point of view was that the Hamidiye era plunged emergent nationalism into the vicious maelstrom of tribal politics. The question to be asked is, would Kurdish nationalism have been stronger in the wake of World War I if the Hamidiye had not existed? Kurdish nationalist historians and Marxist historians make a case that it would have been stronger, but I have tried to demonstrate that this is not the case. The Hamidiye era was a necessary interlude in emergent Kurdish nationalism, marking the third stage in its evolution. It contributed to feelings of solidarity among Sunni Kurds and offered leadership opportunities to many young Kurdish men. The Hamidiye also provided many Kurds with knowledge of military technology and equipment and the capabilities to use it.